In Virginia and Maryland, the development of Negro slavery followed a very different course for several reasons. Most obviously, geographic conditions and the intentions of the settlers quickly combined to produce a successful agricultural staple.
What was that agricultural staple? It was tobacco. And so Dr. Winthrop Jordan, he talks about how slavery in the tobacco colonies, it developed in 3 stages. And the first stage started in 1619, where we get the first 20 Negroes arriving in Virginia. And so during that time period, there's very little written documentation that describes how these people were treated and what their actual status was, right? And so this was the case all the way up until about the 1640s. And so after the 1640s, we get examples describing the Negro's condition as a slave, but not just any old average slave. We're talking about a perpetual slave, a permanent slave. We're talking about the type of slave where the children inherit that status as well. And the intention was to make this continue into the future forever, right? For those people who identify as Negro or Black, right? And so in the third stage is when the colonizers finally begin to put it into law and put the hammer down and make it official, right? And so this started in the 1660s, and by 1705, Virginia had it completely stamped into the law book. So let's go ahead and go over these 3 phases in a little bit more detail to see what Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan can help us glean out of this history so we can go ahead and get us some understanding.
Concerning the first of these stages, there is only one major historical certainty, and unfortunately, it is the sort which historians find hardest to bear. There simply is not enough evidence to indicate with any certainty whether Negroes were treated like white servants or not. At least we can be confident, therefore, that the 2 most common assertions about the first Negroes, that they were slaves and that they were servants, are unfounded, though not necessarily incorrect. And what of the positive evidence? Some of the first group bore Spanish names and presumably had been baptized, which would mean that they were at least nominally Christian, though of the Papist sort. They had been sold to the English, so had other Englishmen, but not by the Dutch. Certainly these Negroes were not fully free, but many Englishmen were not. It can be said, though, that from the first in Virginia, Negroes were set apart from white men by the word Negroes.
By the colonizers calling these people Negroes, that was one of the first ways that they used to create a clear distinction from them and the other English. And so what does the word Negro mean? It means black. And so black in the English mind, it's related to concepts like the devil, evil, wicked, spiritual, and morally without light, and many of the other wild concepts that a person could easily find when you go ahead and look up black in the dictionary. And so most people who identify themselves as black, and even myself when I used to do it, had no conscious understanding or have no conscious understanding of what this name actually implies, right? And even have even less of a clue of why them having brown skin would call themselves black, right, in the first place. And so with the understanding that the English labeled the slaves with a term that was loaded with a lot of intense and derogatory meanings, and it was used as a way to distinguish between the slaves and the other Englishmen, Dr. Winthrop Jordan goes off to say that it was probable that the Negroes never had the same status as the whites, right? But then again, the scholars say that they don't know for sure, right? And so let's go ahead and go into the second phase, where we start to see clear evidence of the differences in status that are being well established. So let's go ahead and watch this.
When the first fragmentary evidence appears from 1640, it becomes clear that some Negroes in both Virginia and Maryland were serving for life, and some Negro children inheriting the same obligation.
So about the year 1640 is when records indicate that black slaves and their children were being subjected to serving for life, right? But it wasn't applicable to all of them, because some of the Negroes, they were released and then they went off to go and own property for themselves, right? And so also some of those Negroes who were released, they went off to own slaves for themselves as well, right? Nathaniel Littleton, he released a black slave named Anthony Johnson, right? And then afterwards, the free black slave Anthony Johnson, he went off on his own to own other black slaves, right? And so this was happening during the earlier colonial periods, right? And so Dr. Winthrop Jordan, he talks about how some of the Negro slaves, they served a usual term. Some of them served a much longer term than the Englishmen. And then some of them served for life, right? Their entire life, no getting out of it. You're in there.
After 1640, when surviving Virginia County court records began to mention Negroes' sales for life, often including any future progeny, were recorded in unmistakable language. In 1646, Francis Potts sold a Negro woman and boy to Stephen Charlton to the use of him forever. Similarly, 6 years later, William Whittington sold to John Pott one Negro girl named Joanne, aged about 10 years, and with her issue and produced during her or either of them for their lifetime and their successors forever. And a Maryland man in 1649 deeded 2 Negro men and a woman, and all of their issue, both male and female. The executors of a York County estate in 1647 disposed of 8 Negroes, 4 men, 2 women, and 2 children, to Captain John Chisman, to have, hold, occupy, possess, and enjoy, and every one of the aforementioned Negroes forever. The will of Roland Burnham of Rappahannock, made in 1657, dispensed his considerable number of Negroes and white servants in language which clearly differentiated between the two by specifying that the whites were to serve for their full term of time, and the Negroes forever.
Now understand that the average English person in the colony was not a slave owner. The slave owners were primarily the planters, who typically came from a background of money, education, and they were business people, right? And so what they did was they communicated with each other, right? Just like other entrepreneurs do, politicians do, and other business people do to this day, right? And they shared ideas. And so one of the ideas that they were apparently sharing was that the whites and the blacks that they owned were to be dealt with differently, right? And so the whites, they were to serve their full term, and then afterwards they were to be set free. And then eventually what they decided was that the blacks that they owned were to serve forever. And you can tell that they were socially engineering the society and that they were thinking about the long-term vision, right? And they saw a bigger picture and they were willing to make a huge sacrifice in the short term, right? And so the reality was that they really didn't care about the average everyday person that they labeled as white. They could care less about those people. Right? It's that the people in position of power, they were really strategizing and trying to ensure a way to have their offspring being set up in the best way possible. Right? And so creating these obvious distinctions in status and servitude was just one of the ways that they were able to do this. And so let's go ahead and move on into the third stage, where we start to see more of the laws and regulations being used by the people who are creating the society. And watch how crafty they are.
Virginia law set Negroes apart from all other groups in a second way by denying them the important right to bear arms. Few restraints could indicate more clearly the denial to Negroes of membership into the white community.
Think about the message being communicated when Virginia passed the law stating that blacks were not allowed to bear arms. Just think about it, right? This was creating an environment to keep those people vulnerable, right? And vulnerable to other groups in that society, and not being able to have the proper means to protect themselves, right? And so this was also implemented to create an environment that would increase the expression of emotions like fear, panic, paranoia, anxiety, stress, and also increase the characteristic trait of dependency within those people, right? And they were also using the law to signal a message to the English from every class and every status that the Negroes, these people, are to be perceived as the group to be at the very bottom in society, right? According to the law. And so the people in position, they were using the law as a tool to drag down the Negro into the pit of vulnerability, right? So let's go ahead and get some more.
In the early 1660s, when slavery was gaining statutory recognition, the assemblies acted with full-throated indignation against miscegenation.
Miscegenation is when people from different races marry each other or have sexual union with each other. And this is more specifically referring to the blacks and the whites.
These acts aimed at more than merely avoiding confusion of status. In 1662, Virginia declared that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending should pay double the usual fine. The next year, Bermuda prohibited all sexual relations between whites and Negroes. 2 years later, Maryland banned interracial marriages. A Maryland Act of 1681 described marriages of white women with Negroes as, among other things, always to the satisfaction of their lascivious and lustful desires, and to the disgrace not only of the English, but also of many other Christian nations.
What does this tell us? It tells us that, one, these relationships were already taking place, because if they were not happening, there would be no need to make it a punishable offense, because you don't punish something that's not happening, right? And two, that these relationships were interfering with how the people in position were trying to shape the society. And this is Virginia that we're talking about. And then afterwards, who do you have next? Bermuda, who the next year they completely prohibited these relationships too. And then 2 years after that, we see Maryland, right? They were doing the same thing. And so what does this tell us? It tells us that this was not by some coincidence, right? But it was by design. And it was designed by a small group of learned people. And they're learned in the matters of shaping and governing societies, right? And so they may not be good at gardening, talking to women, playing sports, fashion, cooking, or anything like that. But for certain and for sure, one thing that they are good at is shaping and governing societies, right? And rocking people's world, right? And manufacturing the reality of people, right? Right before their eyes. And so part of the shaping of the society was a vision to have the people with brown skin, who they labeled as black, being the ones at the bottom. We're talking about an attempt to utterly destroy the complete psychology of those people, and to the point where they could only see themselves as being the doormat of society. And they used every trick imaginable to do this, right? Race, religion, laws, science, propaganda, and hot psychological tactics that the average person has no clue about, right? All this with the attempt to completely debase these people that they socially invented, called blacks or Negroes.
White servants did not suffer this debasement. Rather, their position improved, partly for the reason that they were not Negroes. By the early 1660s, white men were loudly protesting against being made slaves in terms which strongly suggest that they consider slavery not as wrong, but as inapplicable to themselves. Increasingly, white men were more clearly free because Negroes had become so clearly slave.
And so one of the ways that these Europeans became more acquainted with the idea of freedom was watching the liberties of the Negroes get stripped away, right? And then by the comparison of these two very different circumstances, they were able to understand the clear difference, right? Super clear, right? And so this is how the principle of polarity works. And so I remember when I got my first wake-up call about the idea of freedom. And this happened when I was in the Marines, because starting in boot camp or in recruit training, you're told what to do, you're told when to shower, when to eat, when to talk, right? How loud to talk, when to wake up, when to go to sleep. And then from that point going forward for the next 4 years, you don't have control over your life like you did prior to joining in the military, right? And so we had all types of restrictions on how far we can travel on the weekend. Sometimes we had curfews put in place, right? And all types of things that seem like babysitting type of activity, right? Which when you understand it, it is definitely necessary for that environment to function as an organized military, right? And so that's understandable, right? And so it was a wild but necessary experience, right? But after finishing that journey, I was able to see clearly the liberties that many people take for granted in America, because it just seems that it's something that's just normal, right? But it's different when you get those basic liberties stripped away, right? And you can see the difference. And so it was with the stripping of the basic rights and the complete debasement of the Negro. What this allowed the average person who was labeled white to do was to look at the Negro and that circumstance and then judge it against his own circumstance, right? And to get a clear representation of what liberty looked like, right? And so they were able to see the Negro's condition against their own to get this understanding. But understand the trick here that was being used by the members who were forming that society, right? They didn't give the average white person any extra rights. But what they did was they removed the benefits and the rights from the people that they called black, right? And this created a difference. So, for example, if bearing arms, everyone here is able to bear arms in the colonies, what they did was they removed the ability for the blacks to bear arms, right? And it gave this impression here that the average white somehow had gained some type of added benefit or right? But in reality, they were still in this same position right here, right? And the only difference is they're looking down here at the blacks right here who are in the pit now. And the difference is that the blacks just got pushed further and further down into the pit. And so the average white person looking down, they're looking down here and they're seeing these people here in the pit and they're like, oh, snaps, right? And it seems like they somehow gained something, right? But they didn't gain anything, right? And so the people in position, they're using strategy, right? They're using strategy to create as much of a wedge as possible between the average white and black. And so they're doing this so they can begin to see themselves as completely separate, right? And so the law was a very important tool for them being able to do that.
As early as 1669, the Virginia Assembly unabashedly enacted a brutal law which showed where the logic of perpetual servitude was inevitably tending. Unruly servants could be chastened by sentences to additional terms, whereas the only law enforced for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master, mistress, or overseer cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, nor the obstinacy of many of them by other than violent means suppressed. If a slave by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, his master was not to be adjudged guilty of felony, since it cannot be presumed that prepense malice, which alone makes further felony, should induce any man to destroy his own estate.
The Virginia law in 1619, it allowed the masters to kill the slaves and then literally get away with a murder, right? And this was under the assumption that the master would not, without reasonable cause, destroy his own property. And so who were the slaves that were the property? They were the Negroes. And so once again, we see the crafting of societal differences by the people in position. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think about the unconscious message that was being sent to all the people that were in that society at that time. And so think about what this was saying to the white servants, the average free whites, and the blacks who were mostly enslaved at that time, right? Think about the bigger picture. Think about what these people had in mind, and look at the art of what it is that we're seeing here, right? Look at what they're doing and look at how they were doing it, right? Don't get caught up with all the extra emotional parts of this, right? Because this is already done and over with, right? You have to detach yourself from this stuff. You have to study it. You have to get insight from this history, because these people who are putting this stuff in place, these people were real masters at what it is that they did, right? Whether we want to call it wicked, evil, or whatever, right? Whatever meaning we want to attach to it. The point is that they had some knowledge and they had some understanding that allowed them to take this idea that they had from their imagination and then manifest it into the physical reality. And this process and this type of knowledge, this is what has been largely unknown and misunderstood by the masses of people.
By about 1700, the slave ships began spilling forth their black cargoes in greater and greater numbers. By that time, racial slavery and the necessary police powers had been written into law. By that time, too, slavery had lost all resemblance to a perpetual and hereditary version of English servitude, though service for life still seemed to contemporaries its most essential feature. In the last quarter of the 17th century, the trend was to treat Negroes more like property and less like men, to send them to the fields at younger ages, to deny them automatic existence as inherent members of the community, to tighten the bonds on their personal and civil freedom, and correspondingly to loosen the traditional restraints on the master's freedom to deal with his human property as he saw fit.
And there we have it. This is the environment that the colonizers engineered, right? And this environment is what produced much of the mindset and much of the worldview that was inherited by many of the descendants of these people who we see walking around today. And so this here right now is the final phase of freedom, right? It's the final phase of freedom, which means that the old ways of thinking have to be replaced, and they have to be replaced with new ways of thinking, right? Because that's the only way to climb out of the pit and come into the free world where life is much better and it makes much more sense. Right, and so this is the end of part 4 commentary on the book here, White Over Black, American Attitude Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812, written by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. And so I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on the next video.